Good evening, Professor. I am Warren, and I will be doing my presentation on the 32nd President of the United States, FDR Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was born in 1882 at Hyde Park, um, New York. He attended Harvard and Columbia. He attended Harvard University and Columbia Law School for his graduate. On St. Patrick's Day in 1905, he married his fifth cousin, which is Eleanor Roosevelt, which played a huge part in his development as a man and as a president. Franklin D. Roosevelt, known as FDR, and Eleanor Roosevelt were married 45 years until his death. He died at the age of 63, leaving behind 4 sons, a daughter, Anne Roosevelt, James Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr., Elliott Roosevelt, and Jr. John A. Roosevelt. The fifth son, named Franklin D. Roosevelt, actually died in infancy. Following the example of his cousin, which is President Theodore Roosevelt, who he greatly admired and took after, Franklin Roosevelt entered public service through his politics. He was also known as a very charismatic figure. So since this is a communications class, he was a great talker. But he ran his progressive policies as a Democrat. But also he was known as a conservative at the same time. Like, he really believed in forward thinking, but at the same time, he really believed in core values of family. He won the election to the New York State Senate in 1910. President Wilson appointed him as an assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he was the Democratic nominee for Vice President in 1920. FDR is the only president in the United States history to serve more than 2 terms. He actually served 4 of them. There's a special memorial built for him in Washington. He was also elected 4 times, which changed the landscape of the presidency. They eventually changed it after his death, and I think in 1945 is when he passed away. And after that, they changed the term limits. In fact, his memorial has 4 rooms, which takes place in Washington, D.C. Each room is for each term that he served. He was awarded this memorial because of his great tactics that he bestowed upon the American people going depression and the biggest financial crisis in history. What made FDR a great leader was what made him a great leader. His trait was self-confidence. FDR never doubted himself or his own opinions and decisions when came to making big decisions, believing in himself. Advisors during his presidency were puzzled at times, especially in involvement in World War II. Even though he got some pushback, even from his closest advisors, he believed that it was important for the Allies to unite with Britain and even Soviet Union to fight against Axis powers, to change the momentum of the war for the Allies. What made him a great leader, the way he overcame adversity. When he came into office, he was embarked during a precarious time in American history, which was the war and the Great Depression, which many Americans fell under depression. Under 32% of Americans under poverty. If if you're also if also you overcame significant personal adversity, which he contracted polio in 1921, 12 years before becoming president, which left him paralyzed from the waist down. He was self-conscious in speaking in person because he was in a wheelchair. He felt it made him look weak in front of the American people, so he did most of his addresses either through the radio or he had to use canes or some specialized canes, or people had to keep him up to give his public addresses to the country. And the most important trait as a leader was his intelligence. He was well educated, which I mentioned. He went to Harvard and Columbia Law. He was a very intelligent man. But he was a rather curious individual. His biggest strength was his communication skills because he would ask numerous questions. From other leaders, especially his cousin and also a great leader from British Prime Minister, which is Winston Churchill. His appetite for knowledge and the ability to consume information was an asset for his presidency and progressed in influential issues with urgency and conviction. FDR worked with many others by first creating the New Deal that was enacted in during the Great Depression. He first worked with Congress to abolish the prohibition, the sale of alcohol, ratifying the 21st Amendment. He also signed Tennessee Valley Act, which he forces the federal government to build dams along the Tennessee River to control flooding and generate inexpensive hydraulic power for people in the region. Most importantly, he also worked with Congress to pass Social Security to help protect the most vulnerable citizens, especially the elderly and those who fell on hard times will have a safety net if ever they were to go through a certain they will lose their job or have some kind of instability. For his legacy, Franklin Roosevelt changed the way America is ran by implementing executive orders for infrastructure, Social Security, and by entering World War to defeat the Axis powers. He helped get America out of the Great Depression and lead America against the Axis powers. Many of his critics were non-progressives felt that he undermined the free market and used his executive powers to implement social programs, which many took shots at him that actually have transformed they believe they will transform the nation into a welfare state. But it was much needed since many Americans were out of work. And most importantly, dug us out of the roughest patches. Him as president, he dug us out of the most roughest patches in history, which was the Great Depression, which we fell to the lowest unemployment in history. And he also led us through the most important war in history, which a certain power in Axis, which Adolf Hitler, could have been this close of taking over the world if it wasn't for FDR's diligence to work with Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and also having to work with Russia, which it was a communist country, but he did what he had to do to preserve the democracy that we all enjoy today, which I believe FDR is significant in history and one of the most important leaders of all time. Thank you, Professor.